and welcome to another episode of Metal Effort. My name is Nehemiah, and today we're going to have a little discussion. I'm going to be talking about guilty pleasure EDC, specifically focusing on knives, but I think the discussion will be useful in many different hobbies where you're trying to buy or collect something. So hopefully this is useful to people more than the knife hobby, but this will definitely kind of ring true to those people more than anything else, because you know what I'm talking about in terms of the context. Now, what do I mean by guilty pleasure? So this is something that you personally like, but maybe is not the most objectively sane opinion comparing to other people or just common sensibilities. Something like a terrible movie that most people hate, but just for whatever reason you just find enjoyable and you like. So guilty pleasures come in, multiple shapes and sizes, and I want to be very specific with this conversation and what I mean, because I think there's some things we can glean from thinking about this very carefully and maybe potentially help us make better purchasing decisions, selling decisions, kind of collecting decisions, kind of really thinking about this and figuring out in your own self, this is something I want you to reflect on, kind of what your thoughts are on the subject. Obviously, I'm in my own head. I've got the subjective experience of being me. So all this is going to come through, my biases, which is kind of the whole topic of this. But you're going to have to think about this on your own and replace, certain brands or names or whatever. But hopefully you'll get the idea and it'll make sense. Now, I have three things to talk about. First one is the opportunity cost of having a knife. That is going to weigh heavy on many of you. Now, most of us have some kind of budget. Maybe it's a small budget, a big budget. I think this can apply equally to everyone, just on different scales. But there's going to be that knife that you currently want but don't have because you're telling yourself it's too expensive, right? Sometimes, it's a knife that you do have the money for, but you just can't buy it. I think that's a different conversation. It's more kind of finding where your ultimate kind of high end is. And we've heard Nick talk about hedonic adaptation before, and that ceiling is going to get taller and taller and taller as you get used to whatever current level of what knives you like. So let's say I have a really expensive knife that I purchased and currently own. As I possess this knife, that money is going to be tied up. I can't use it to buy food. I can't use it to pay my bills. It's tied up in this knife. Now, I could sell it and I could get the money and I could spend it, right? If I needed to. But the question is, how much money is this tying up? I think there's also an important question of how much has this knife depreciated? Because as time goes on, most things become worth less and less and less, even by virtue of just inflation at the very least. There are exceptions. Obviously, some knives get more expensive if they're stopped being produced and getting more rare. There's obviously exceptions to that rule. But in the vast majority of time, like it or not, your stuff is becoming less valuable. Now, I take a knife that I enjoy. I use it, take it out, look at it, flip it, cut with it. I get joy out of using a knife, right? But I have to kind of quantitate that joy into a number, into how much it's actually worth in dollars to me, right? And there's times where, especially as a reviewer, I spend a lot of time thinking about this and being very careful in how I consider these things. Is it worth the money that it costs to buy it, right? Because you can have a $1,500 knife be worth it, where an $800 knife not be worth it, right? It's not linear to just how much it costs. And so me as a reviewer, I'm very careful to say, kind of give you my opinion. It's not like I'm laying out the law of the land or anything like that, but I'm giving you my opinion, my take, my perspective on whether a particular knife is worth the asking price, right? Now, sometimes there's knives where I would not recommend a knife, not necessarily saying that knife is a bad knife, just maybe not worth the asking price. I think a recent example would be like the Hinderer Full Track, for instance. It's a great knife. I like it a lot. But is it worth the price? And if it was a less expensive knife, I think it would be a gem. So really, in that particular case, we're talking about price is like the main like determining factor of me being able to recommend that knife or not. So knives in this category, I'm going to put into the opportunity cost category of a guilty pleasure. So maybe, you can agree with me kind of on a logical, non-biased plane somewhere saying you're right. There's better knives for cheaper costs. That is happening enough in, a certain number of cases, be it entire companies or particular knives. And you can like sober say to yourself and to somebody else, that knife is not worth the $600 that they're asking for it. Okay. But maybe you still want it, right? And so that's really the only thing that's hanging you up is that opportunity cost. Because just because it costs more, if you're willing to, let's say we think it's $150 overpriced, then in addition to the current amount of money that's tied up in that knife, you can pay an extra $150 to actually buy the knife, but that's worth it to you. And it's kind of irrational on some level, but you like it enough. It's kind of a guilty pleasure that you're willing to just kind of put up with it. I think we especially trick ourselves into this when that opportunity cost or when the value of that knife is pretty stable. If you can invest, $600 into that knife and know that there's enough demand for the knife that you could go onto a knife swap on Reddit, probably sell it for $550 within minutes, right? So it's easy for you to kind of psychologically trick yourself into keeping these otherwise non-gems in your collection in spite of our rationality. So that's kind of painting the picture. I'm spending a lot of time on this first point, but I think this is a good place to start. Second thing is kind of the opposite, where you have a knife. Let's say maybe it costs like, $300 to get a knife. And that knife is like mass produced. People maybe hotly anticipate it, and it's kind of hard to get at the beginning. And then, enough people get it in their hands, enough reviewers start posting their reviews, and it turns out maybe it's not a bad knife. It's just not living up to the hype. Maybe it's just not what we all hoped it was. And the price on that drops. The secondary market, maybe it falls to like low 200s, where it's still possible to buy a brand new one for the asking retail, but people essentially stop buying it at that price. And then if somebody did buy it at that price and that's tying up money, they're thinking kind of in the opposite of like, oh, this is opportunity cost, but I want to sell it before it becomes worth even less than the already tumbling kind of secondary market. This is getting into the territory of a sunk cost fallacy of thinking, well, maybe I'll just keep it because it's not worth much, right? I've already spent my $300 and I want to maximize my value. If I sell at $200, then I'm guaranteeing my $100 loss. But maybe I'll just convince myself, maybe through a little bit of subconscious, cognitive dissonance, that the knife is better than it actually is, or that you are making up or convincing yourself of reasons to keep that knife in spite of it not really being what you hoped it was. So I'm calling that one just kind of a depreciation, sunk cost reason for having a guilty pleasure and not getting rid of it. And I think the rational thing to do, if you are not really all that happy about a knife and how it turned out, but you've already bought it, regardless of whether the price is tumbling down, if you don't sell it, that money, all of the money is gone. You're not going to get it back. So maybe take that $200 loss, or sell it for $200 and lose that $100 to get a knife you do enjoy might actually be better. And it's hard for us to do that. So that's another kind of a irrational example of, a guilty pleasure. In my personal experience, just to give you some examples of these 2 points that I've given, for the, sunk cost idea would be like the mini Therium. I reviewed that knife. Everybody was pretty excited about it. My review was definitely on the negative side. I talked about the positives, and there were things to be positive about, but I came down pretty hard on it. And I think I was on the lower end of the spectrum as far as the overall opinion of that knife. But the hype kind of died down. I mean, this is, my perception of it, but I feel like that knife didn't live up to its expectations. Obviously, I personally had a negative opinion of the knife on the whole, but when I go to sell it, I bought it at like $200. By the time I sold it, I think I had to get down to like $100. Like, nobody wanted to buy the knife, and it was in good condition. It's not like I had damaged it or something. It was perfectly fine. And so that's an example of, like, I was keeping that knife because, man, $100, may as well keep it. And then I reminded myself of the cognitive fallacy, the logical fallacy that I just made. So I ended up selling that knife, and I'm glad I did. I had reinvested that money back into another knife, and obviously I'm a reviewer, so I need to get more knives. So there's a little bit more pressure for that kind of thing on me than non-reviewers. But still, the point remains, there are knives that kind of fit into that category. And so I'm not necessarily telling you that you shouldn't have guilty pleasure knives. I'm more just talking about, why do we have guilty pleasure knives? I don't want to tell you how to live. It's just pointing out our rationality and the reasons that we would keep or sell a knife that doesn't really make sense sometimes. Next one is just subjective experience. This is your personal consciousness, really, that, kind of in the philosophy of the mind, I have my own internal dialogue. I'm speaking to myself in the first person. I assume that everybody else is doing the same thing, but I don't actually have empirical proof of that. And this is kind of where the subjectiveness of everything that we like, really comes into play. And so the point that I want to make is understanding, both in yourself and in other people, which I think makes the community less toxic. And I'm not saying that the community is toxic, but just communities in general and many different hobbies tend to get this way, where you forget how strongly we each are kind of swayed by our own irrational emotions. And so there's something about, I look at this knife and I think this is the coolest thing ever. It just, I reviewed it and I tried to be as non-biased as I could, but there's something about this knife that is just affecting me in a positive way, of like a futuristic, industrial, gentleman's tactical knife that is just tickling my brain in the right way. And so, if you're very careful and you train yourself, you can still be objective about the knife. But as far as like my irrational bias to just keep this knife forever is overpowering what my normal logical brain would say. Maybe it has to do with my love of sci-fi or Star Trek or Star Wars or something along those lines that just makes me think this knife is freaking sweet. And so there's times where somebody else will look at this knife and think it is butt ugly and not like it. And even if I told them all the, practical reasons why it's such an awesome knife, they're biased in the opposite direction, is just going to convince them to focus on the negatives and not like the knife. And this is just, all I'm not responding to anybody. Nobody said this is butt ugly, to me at least, just as an example. And so I think, as a reviewer, I need to really be careful of this, because I don't want my, subjective experience to overshadow what I'm talking about or how I talk about it, so that you can get a good read of, here's the things that I have noticed that are good and bad. But really, it's just an excuse to talk about the knife and how the different aspects of the knife work and the pros and cons of those in like a practical, way. And so you could decide for yourself if those things are good or bad or what you actually care about, right? And so I think when we understand how irrational we're being with our purchasing, it's not that we should completely shun these emotions or disavow them. I mean, really, practically speaking, you should get one good knife and not buy any more, I guess. But that's just not fun. That's not what humans want to do. We want to have the variety of life, and we want to tinker and play with things, and we want to look a certain way. And, oh, look at the color of this knife matches the color of my pen and my wallet. And it's like, we chuckle at people that have matching shoes and purses and bags. We're doing the same thing. This is a very human thing to do. And it's not necessarily bad, but I think once you look under the hood, in your own mind, in your own psyche, understand why you're doing these things, then I think you can maybe make some better choices that help you, actually enjoy the knives that you don't have to fool yourself into enjoying. Back to that example of selling the mini therium at a loss and taking that money and getting a knife you actually want, right? That just makes sense. Even if it doesn't make sense that I have that second knife at all. So it's varying degrees of rationality. And so I think you can maximize your irrationality with more rationality. With that discussion kind of out of the way, I just want to give you some information of like what my current biases are. And again, I'm trying to avoid these current biases, but if I look at my channel and I look at the knives that I reviewed, I have to be serious with myself and just acknowledge that I have a bias. And I think it's only fair for you to know what those biases are and, know where I'm coming from, know my perspective on these things. So I'm going to give you some examples. So if we look at kind of the points that I made in the opportunity cost, low depreciation point, these would be things that, cost a lot, are good, but just cost too much. So for me, what I personally think these are, and your list is going to be different than mine. I'm just telling you this for full disclosure. I think Sebenzas are, a lot of Chris Reeves knives are at that point where they're too expensive, I think, for what they give. If everything was just $100 less, I would feel a lot better about it. The good news is that Sebenzas have such good, resale value that it's one of those things that I think people can trick themselves into having because they could easily sell it if they needed to. Still, I don't like the idea of tying that much money up and just, perfectly competent but kind of boring, non-progressive knife. Different steels, a front flipper, like, what have you done for me lately type of a deal would get me a lot more excited about having a Sebenza. But as it stands, if somebody gave me a Sebenza, I would totally keep it, but I would not go buy one. And a lot of the knives that or the companies that I'm gonna talk about in this first point fall into that category of they're very giftable because they're expensive enough you wouldn't buy it for yourself, valuable enough that somebody else gave it to you, you would keep it, knowing if times really went bad, you could sell it if you needed to, but mostly you could just use, the sentimental value of receiving a gift like that as a good excuse to just always keep it. Another one would be Hinderer knives. I gave the example of the full track, the half track, both fall into that category. I think for me, Medfords. I kind of want a Medford knife. Something like the Das Haas or Das Hus or the little miniature one. I'm kind of interested in that just because the price is a little bit down. I kind of like the idea of a small Medford. I think it just kind of infuriates him that he has to make small knives, and so I think I like that knife just out of spite. But a normal full size like Praetorian or Velociraptor or whatever it is, I don't need that. That is so much money tied up, and it's just not worth it. His crap steels, no. I think Benchmade is barely in that category where I think everything is just a little overpriced in Benchmade, and everybody's just goo eyes over Benchmade. So it's like, yeah, get a Benchmade. It's going to have a good resale value because, I don't know, they're like the Apple of the knife community. It's just weird. Another one, and this is going to be a little bit crazy because I have it on the table here, and that's going to be sheer Gore Offs, I think, fall in this category. I think they're excellent knives. I reviewed both the Hadiar and the Hadian, and they are definitely gems in terms of how good the knife actually is. They are way, way too overpriced. And so, this knife I got a pretty good deal on. Van X37 are kind of hard to come by. This is like the perfect color configuration. This is like my exact Hadi that I want. And I got a good price for it. And I think that's the reason I'm convincing myself to keep this. But it's definitely overpriced. I can't recommend a sheer Gore Off right now. they need to drop their prices by like 20 or 30% for me to actually feel good about recommending these, if money is a concern at all for the person I'm recommending for. Good, let's get some examples of some depreciation knives, things that are sunk costs. Ones that I'll kind of talk about brands. And I don't like grouping brands all together, you know, like Medford. In general, all his knives are not something I'd be interested in. But if they're small, like the MIDI Slim Marauder or whatever, I'm interested in that. I would review that. But on the whole, I'm not that crazy about Reich. I'm not that crazy about Ruwaiki. And I'm not that crazy about Kaiser. Not because they're bad knives per se, but you buy those knives and the resale value is just not that great. They're like too widely available. They're too inexpensive to start with that, you know, it's easy to like buy a knife for 120 and then the used market is already down to like $80. You know, that percentage wise, I think it's easier for people to kind of dismiss like some of these China brands. That's not the rule. That's not a slight on China brands. You know, I think We is still holding their own. I think Riot is up there with We. Ruwaiki is like right in the middle zone. Kaiser's right in the middle zone. I think Reich is definitely at the bottom of the barrel there. But I think there's some kind of bias in not just me, but a lot of people of just like China knives are not worth as much. That's, you know, not just the knife industry, but a lot of different industries that's kind of the psyche. And so it's kind of hard to, you know, work your brain around that of like getting all huffy and puffy when a Wii costs $300 when it's like, this is a $900 knife. Is it 3 times as good as the $300 Wii? No. It's like maybe 10% better. Like, we really do have to kind of realign our values of these things. So I think for that reason, because people are undervaluing China knives and overvaluing American and high-end Russian knives, there's a bias that develops in the secondary market and can kind of mess with our whole psyche here. Last thing, and this is just general biases, I'm not in the like tactical, like murdery, kind of appealing to the 14-year-old teenager aspect. So I feel like ZT kind of placates to that. I feel like Cold Steel kind of placates to that. Kershaw does. Those brands, and I'm not saying there aren't specific knives in those companies that I wouldn't appreciate or wouldn't mind owning, but just in general, it takes a little bit extra to convince me to actually buy one of those knives because I'm so opposed to just the marketing, I guess, and the kind of attitude of like the stigma that knives have attached to brands like that, of just like, I'm like a weirdo, like stabby type of person. That's not me. Like I want to be useful to people around me by having a tool that proves itself to be useful when you have one in your pocket. Like, just like I have a pen. Oh, by the way, this is totally I'm going to review this knife, but this is totally a guilty pleasure. This is something I can't recommend, but I just love. It's way too expensive. It's tying up too much money. It doesn't make any sense at all, but it makes me happy. So I think those are, you know, just some things that you should know about this. I hope this kind of sparks some, you know, things in your own purchasing habits and how you think about these knives. And maybe we can, you know, do a little experiment to buy, you know, a knife from a brand that you've never owned before and just try to exercise, you know, a different part of your mind that you normally are biased against. You know, it's like I always used to get chicken in my Chipotle burritos, and, you know, one day I had steak and I was like, wow, this is totally different and I like it. But I still miss chicken, and that's where the whole genesis of I like half chicken, half steak comes from. So I don't know, maybe I'll buy a ZT or a Cold Steel. Maybe, I don't know. This is hard. That's it, everybody. I hope this was a fun conversation. I'll see you in my next video. Bye.